The Stanford Prison Experiment, a forensic deconstruction of psychology's most celebrated fraud, the myth that won't die. For 50 years, the Stanford Prison Experiment has functioned as psychology's most powerful parable about human evil. Textbooks presented as empirical proof that ordinary people, given institutional permission, inevitably transform into sadists. Philip Zimbardo built an entire career on this narrative, arguing that situational forces eclipse individual morality with terrifying ease. But what if psychology's most famous demonstration of human darkness was itself a demonstration of scientific fraud? What if the experiment that supposedly revealed our capacity for spontaneous cruelty was actually a masterclass in researcher manipulation and data suppression? This is the forensic autopsy of that myth. The conventional story presents the Stanford Prison Experiment as naturalistic observation. Assign normal young men to prisoner or guard roles, then watch as the situation spontaneously generates brutality. Evil emerges inevitably, like a chemical reaction. This narrative is empirically indefensible. Zimbardo didn't observe tyranny. He orchestrated it. Recently released audio recordings reveal a researcher who functioned as theatrical director, not detached scientist. He explicitly instructed guards to create feelings of frustration and a sense of fear. He told them to make prisoners feel powerless. This wasn't neutral instruction. This was directive scripting. In experimental psychology, demand characteristics are cues that communicate what behaviors researchers expect. These cues contaminate data by transforming genuine responses into performative compliance. The Stanford Prison Experiment wasn't contaminated by demand characteristics. It was constructed from them. Guard Dave Eshelman later admitted he consciously modeled his behavior on a sadistic prison warden from Cool Hand Luke. He stated explicitly, "I thought that would be interesting to them. The cruelty wasn't spontaneous. It was choreographed compliance with perceived experimental demands." Zimbardo didn't merely set the stage. He intervened continuously. When guards proved insufficiently aggressive, he personally coached them toward greater psychological oppression. The dependent variable, guard behavior, was being systematically manipulated by the principal investigator himself. This represents fundamental methodological fraud. Legitimate research requires strict neutrality to avoid contaminating natural behavioral patterns. Zimbardo obliterated this boundary, serving simultaneously as hypothesis generator, stage director, and lead actor. The Lucifer effect, Zimbardo's theoretical contribution, rests entirely on the premise that situational forces override individual morality with minimal pressure. But when the situation is engineered by explicit researcher directives, when participants consciously perform behaviors they believe the researcher desires, the experiment demonstrates nothing about spontaneous human behavior. It demonstrates only that people comply with authority figures who explicitly instruct them to behave cruelly, a phenomenon requiring no basement theater to establish. The experiment's rhetorical power derives from its claim to have used normal participants, ordinary young men who could be anyone's sons or brothers. If these average individuals descended into barbarism, we all carry this potential within us. This foundational claim is false. In 2019, researchers accessed previously sealed archives containing original personality assessments. What they discovered fundamentally undermines the experiment's claims about universal human nature. The participants weren't psychologically average. They were self-selected respondents to an advertisement seeking volunteers for a psychological study of prison life. This advertisement functioned as a selection mechanism, attracting individuals with pre-existing interest in power dynamics and institutional control. The personality assessments revealed participants scored significantly higher than population norms on narcissism. They scored lower on empathy and agreeableness. The experiment selected for individuals already predisposed toward interpersonal exploitation and reduced empathic capacity. Zimbardo claimed his screening eliminated psychological abnormalities, ensuring only normal individuals participated. The archived data reveals this as technically true but substantively dishonest. While participants fell within normal ranges on clinical measures, they weren't actively psychotic. Their personality profiles clustered toward the antisocial end of normal distribution. This is selection bias of the most insidious variety, technically defensible, empirically fraudulent. When you recruit individuals high in narcissism and place them in positions of arbitrary power, their behavior becomes predictable rather than surprising. When you select for Machiavellianism and create an environment where manipulation carries no consequences, you haven't revealed hidden human potential. You've simply removed normal social constraints, regulating pre-existing antisocial inclinations. The experiment's conclusions require that observed behaviors emerged from situational forces acting on neutral psychological material. The personality data demonstrates the material wasn't neutral. It was preloaded with exactly the traits that would manifest as cruelty when given institutional permission and active researcher encouragement. Here is the statistical reality that should have demolished the experiment's credibility. Only approximately 30% of guards engaged in sadistic behaviors. The majority, 70%, did not. 7 out of 10 individuals assigned to guard roles, despite explicit researcher instructions to create distress, despite peer modeling of cruelty, despite complete absence of external accountability, did not become brutal. If situational forces were truly overwhelming, we would expect near universal compliance. Instead, we observe substantial resistance, even under conditions of maximum researcher pressure and minimal consequences for cruelty. The archived materials document guards who actively resisted oppressive dynamics. Some refused to enforce petty rules. Others engaged prisoners in conversations, acknowledging their humanity. Several explicitly questioned whether the punitive atmosphere was ethically defensible. One guard deliberately worked night shifts to avoid participating in escalating cruelty. The conventional narrative presents the experiment as evidence that good people abandon morality when granted power. The suppressed evidence demonstrates the opposite. Most people, even when explicitly instructed to be cruel, even when peers model brutality, will resist dehumanizing others. In legitimate science, when 70% of your sample fails to exhibit predicted behavior, you revise your hypothesis. Zimbardo committed methodological fraud by selectively highlighting the 30% who confirmed his expectations, while burying the majority who contradicted it. His published accounts, congressional testimony, popular books, and TED Talks focus obsessively on the minority of sadistic guards, while virtually ignoring the majority who resisted. The experiment's iconic images document the behavior of a statistical minority presented as universal human response. This represents active data suppression in service of predetermined theoretical agenda. When his data showed most individuals maintained moral agency despite extreme pressure, he simply ignored the inconvenient majority and built his theory on the cooperative minority. The silent majority of guards who resisted cruelty represent the experiment's actual discovery, a discovery systematically buried because it contradicted the researchers' theoretical commitments and dramatic narrative preferences. One of the experiment's most powerful evidence pieces came when prisoner 8612, Douglas Corpy, apparently suffered complete psychological breakdown on day 2. The footage appears harrowing, Corpy screaming, crying, seeming to lose contact with reality. Zimbardo presented this as evidence of the simulation's authentic psychological power, proof that the situation had overwhelmed a normal young man's mental defenses within 36 hours. This entire narrative is false. Corpy was performing. In subsequent interviews, Corpy explained with disarming clarity. He faked his breakdown to escape the experiment because he had a GRE exam approaching and needed study time. He wasn't experiencing psychotic decompensation. He was strategically deploying theatrical distress to manipulate his way out. Corpy's own words. I was trying to demonstrate that I was suffering. I was play acting. He consciously intensified his display when initial requests to leave were denied, calculating that sufficiently dramatic performance would force researchers to release him. What makes this particularly revealing is that Zimbardo recognized Corpy's performance as theatrical, yet initially refused to release him. They knew he was acting, yet treated his acted distress as requiring intervention only after he had sufficiently broken down to satisfy whatever dramatic threshold Zimbardo had established. This represents profound ethical violation. Once a participant requests withdrawal, participation must end immediately. Instead, Zimbardo engaged in grotesque negotiation, requiring Corpy to perform sufficient psychological breakdown to earn the right to withdraw. For decades, Corpy's breakdown served as centerpiece evidence that the mock prison could induce authentic psychological trauma. But if the breakdown was performed, it demonstrates nothing about environmental psychological impact, only that a participant was willing to lie to escape an inconvenient commitment. A responsible researcher discovering fake distress would exclude that data and acknowledge the deception in published results. Zimbardo built his most powerful evidence for environmental determinism on footage of acknowledged performance. In 2002, British psychologists conducted a systematic replication with critical methodological improvements. They didn't coach participants toward predetermined behaviors. They didn't select for pathological traits. They maintained proper ethical boundaries and neutral observation. The results contradicted virtually every conclusion Zimbardo had drawn. Guards did not spontaneously descend into cruelty. Prisoners did not passively accept subordination. Instead, participants actively questioned the arbitrary power structure, negotiated egalitarian relationships, and ultimately organized to dismantle the hierarchical system entirely. When researcher demand characteristics are eliminated, when selection bias is controlled, when ethical boundaries are maintained, the inevitable emergence of tyranny disappears. What emerges instead is collective resistance to arbitrary authority and spontaneous movement toward democratic organization. Zimbardo's theory predicts that placing individuals in positions of arbitrary power will reliably generate tyranny. This prediction has repeatedly failed. In the BBC replication where egalitarianism emerged, in the 70% of Stanford guards who resisted cruelty, in real-world prison environments where most corrections officers don't engage in predicted sadistic behaviors, by any reasonable scientific standard, the theory should have been abandoned decades ago. Instead, it persists, not because it's empirically supported, but because it provides compelling narrative confirming pre-existing beliefs about human nature's essential darkness. The experiment's most pernicious legacy isn't its methodological failures, it's the deterministic ideology it promotes. The implicit message when people commit atrocities, blame the system rather than holding individuals accountable. This is biological determinism in situational clothing. The argument that human behavior is determined by forces beyond individual control. This ideology provides comfortable absolution for perpetrators, encourages learned helplessness by suggesting resistance is futile, undermines moral education, and creates self-fulfilling prophecies. When people believe cruelty is inevitable in certain situations, they're less likely to resist cruel role expectations. The deterministic narrative ignores overwhelming historical evidence of moral resistance. Individuals who sheltered Jews during the Holocaust, whistleblowers who expose institutional corruption, soldiers who refuse unlawful orders, prison guards who report colleague abuse. These aren't exceptional heroes. They're ordinary individuals who maintained moral agency despite situational pressures designed to extinguish it. The Stanford Prison Experiment's true legacy isn't what it revealed about human nature. It's what it reveals about the seductive appeal of deterministic narratives that absolve us of moral responsibility. The suppressed truth, the resistance of the silent majority, the performance of the supposedly broken, the methodological manipulation required to generate even minority compliance, points toward a more demanding conclusion. Moral agency persists even in oppressive circumstances. Don't wait for a savior. Don't blame the situation. Be the guard who works the night shift to avoid participating in cruelty. Be the 70% who maintain humanity, despite pressure to abandon it. Be the person who recognizes that roles are performances, and you can always refuse to read the lines that power has written for you. The basement in Stanford didn't prove evil is inevitable. It proved that when you know what to look for, you can recognize manipulation, resist demand characteristics, and maintain moral agency, even when systems conspire to extinguish it. That's what really happened.